Russia. From pogroms to penal colonies, from gulags to straight-up disappearances, there are few prison systems in the entire world that are more feared than the one concocted deep in the darkest corners of Moscow. From the days of the Imperial Tsars to Soviet dictators to the modern-day regime under Vladimir Putin, Russia's penal system is among the most brutal and utterly deadly in history. But over the course of the last 140 years or more, there is no single Russian prison more infamous than Lefortovo. Cradled inside the city of Moscow itself and tucked away into an unassuming small 4-story building, Lefortovo has been the cage for some of Russia's most notorious and valuable inmates since Nicholas II was hardly a man, let alone a Tsar. Since then, it has gained a reputation for torture, brutal interrogations, close ties with generation after generation of secret police, and the utter, intentionally crafted misery it inflicts on the people inside. Today we'll be pulling back the curtain on Lefortovo prison, why it was created, what it eventually became, and some of the names and stories of the people who've been kept captive behind its pale yellow walls. Now, in the years that Lefortovo prison was constructed, Russia was a very different place than it is today. Ruled over by a long line of Tsars, Russia was already the world's largest nation by size, with a population well past 100 million and representing over a dozen smaller nationalities, many with their own languages and customs. Primarily agricultural, socially regressive, and sparsely populated in most areas, Russia was, in that time, ruled only loosely by its leaders in Moscow. But despite Imperial Russia's limited resources, the nation still boasted a strong military, and Lefortovo prison was created as one small part of an effort to make that military a bit more modern. Completed in 1881, Lefortovo prison was first intended to be a military penitentiary serving units in and around the capital, and in the early days, it didn't have much of a reputation at all. It was the sort of place Russians would be sent for minor military offences, and was sort of a revolving door or even a slap on the wrist for prisoners who generally transitioned in and out in short order. During World War I, the prison held German POWs, as did much of the Russian penal system at that time. But like so many things in Russia, that all changed when the Bolsheviks came. Riding a wave of popular discontent with the old order, the Marxist-Leninist Bolsheviks seized power in Moscow in 1917, and when they did, the purges began. Lefortovo wasn't the only prison the Bolsheviks used, but it was one of only a very small number located directly in and around Moscow at that time. Because of that geographic proximity, it became a favorite for the Bolsheviks to hold political prisoners and dissidents during the Lenin years. This wasn't a place where, say, murderers or looters went. Instead, it was essentially a holding tank for intellectuals and dissidents in the early years before the Soviets had figured out what to do with those sorts of people in the long term. And once they figured out what those prisoners' fates were going to be, the individuals might have left Lefortovo prison, but the prison itself became even more deeply enmeshed into the Soviet system. Roughly a decade after infamous Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin came to power, he embarked on an act alternately known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror, imprisoning and executing incredible numbers of fellow communists and ordinary Soviet citizens in a concerted effort to eliminate his rivals and consolidate his power over the Soviet Union. Roughly 700,000 people are believed to have died in the years of the Great Purge, and Lefortovo prison featured prominently in not just a few, but many of their deaths. During those years, Lefortovo fell under the control of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, better known as the NKVD. It was the Soviet Union's dominant secret police organization at that time, with an all-powerful hold on Soviet internal matters, and the people involved were not the sort of people that you wanted aware of your existence. Lefortovo prison became one of the NKVD's favorite detention facilities, and it was a frequent stopping point for purge victims who had been disappeared into the Russian penal system. Lefortovo was particularly dangerous because of its status as a pre-trial center, where, in a totalitarian state like Soviet Russia, the NKVD had two basic objectives. First, they were going to torture the living hell out of their prisoners until they confessed to something juicy enough to make for a really damning show trial, regardless of whether that confession was accurate or just made up under duress. And secondly, any victims who weren't going to be held in the penal system for long were going to get their torture and other extreme punishments dealt out of them in the days or weeks before the NKVD had to present any sort of case on why they'd been taken. Lefortovo prison was altered to match that nefarious purpose. It was installed with torture chambers specialized for purposes of extracting confessions under duress, and it was organized and fitted out with the intent of being a very, very active location for the NKVD's interrogators. Among their number was Stalin's own secret police chief, one Lavrentiy Beria, who was a common sight around Lefortovo around this time. In addition to all of his other work, repressing the Soviet population, Beria took a direct role in the prisoner interrogations and executions at Lefortovo, performing an unknown but not unsubstantial number of them himself. In those same years, more than one contemporary source attested that the NKVD had installed an oversized meat grinder to dispose of human bodies, although those claims have never been substantiated. Eventually, the purges ended, and in the Soviet Union's post-Stalin years, Lefortovo remained a mainstay detention facility for the NKVD's successor organization, the KGB. Under their iron fist, two sorts of people tended to find their way to Lefortovo: political dissidents and those suspected of spy work. Especially common, at least proportional to their number in Soviet society, were the family members and associates of recently deposed or recently deceased Soviet leaders, as their political successors brought waves of investigations and charges against those who were seen as living representations of a potentially dangerous rival legacy. Reports from that time attest to small cells painted black and kept lit day and night by a single hanging bulb, with their occupants frequently hit by guards, kept without food for days, or pushed into tiny, freezing cold isolation cells. In the years since the KGB was in control of the prison, the modern-day FSB have taken over seamlessly. And it's here that we find Lefortovo prison as it exists now. And it's not the sort of place you'd ever want to see for yourself. Drive through the streets of Moscow today, and you might miss Lefortovo prison entirely. Located in a small, utterly unremarkable compound in Moscow's southeastern Lefortovo district, a quiet and relatively affluent part of the city, the building that hosts the prison could easily be mistaken for an apartment building, a school, or a set of municipal offices. Painted in a pale yellow and surrounded by a wall, it's the sort of thing that you wouldn't look twice at if you saw it from a distance, peering past an apartment block that very intentionally obstructs the prison from view via the surrounding streets. It's only when you get close that you might make out the bars over the windows, the concertina wire coils, and the guard towers looking inward on the compound from the outside. Although it's difficult to get a read on just how many people are kept inside Lefortovo at a given time, most estimates place the number of incarcerated people just north or just south of 200. Of those 200, most are kept in solitary confinement for a period of anywhere between a couple of months and a couple of years. Others quarantined for a few days and then placed into cells with up to 2 cellmates, although outside accounts indicate that a cellmate in Lefortovo is a rare privilege. And it is, indeed, a privilege, even despite the risk that one cellmate might be an informant for the KGB. It's a privilege because, as we're about to see, Lefortovo is designed with one crushing burden firmly in mind for its prisoners: total isolation from each other and from the outside world. The prisoners at Lefortovo are held in a K-shaped wing of the main 4-story building, with several floors worth of cells arranged along short hallways. Those cells are identical, regardless of the number of people inside. They're roughly 8 square meters per cell, that's 85 square feet. Inside, inmates are afforded a cot, shelves, a television, exclusively broadcasting Russian state TV, a refrigerator for prison commissary items, a small table and chair, and a toilet separated from the rest of the cell by only a small half-wall. Barred windows allow prisoners to see the sky and receive a bit of natural light, although they won't be able to see anything else of their surroundings. Officers are on constant patrol, with one ex-prisoner reporting that officers would peer into a cell every 2 to 3 minutes. The overhead lights do not go off at night. Instead, they get brighter. The cells themselves are kept immaculate. One ex-inmate reported that, unlike other Russian carceral facilities, Lefortovo was kept completely bare of graffiti or other markers that prior prisoners had ever existed there. Across the building is an administrative wing under control of the FSB, and although the FSB is technically supposed to be kept separate from the prison under a law made to appease the Council of Europe, the FSB wing and the prison itself are separated only by a doorway. Outside, prisoners are allowed 1 hour's walk each day in a restricted courtyard, which they'll typically do alone. While they do, loud music will frequently be blasted over the radio in order to prevent prisoners from hearing each other, in keeping with the intense isolation forced onto every detainee at Lefortovo. Also on premises is a small Russian Orthodox church consisting of several small cabins, again with the express intent to ensure that inmates cannot be seen by each other while going to and from that portion of the facility. Other than their time in the yard and the chapel, inmates can expect only to leave for interrogations, medical procedures, court dates, or to transfer to their more permanent holding facilities. They'll typically get to shower about once each week. But Lefortovo's physical layout doesn't come close to capturing what it's like to be imprisoned there in the modern day. According to one prominent lawyer who's made a career out of representing the sorts of people who end up there, that's one Yevgeny Smirnov, the real trick at Lefortovo centers around what he describes as, quote, total information isolation. As Smirnov explained to the Associated Press, no calls, no visitation, no newspapers, nothing. At best they will receive letters, and even then, most likely with a delay of a month or two. It's one of the tools of suppression. Without knowledge of the outside world or any means to interact with their broader surroundings, prisoners are left entirely alone with their own thoughts and the terror of having been swept up by the modern Russian carceral system. And when we say terror there, we really do mean it. In addition to the total information isolation at Lefortovo, the prison is built to be quiet at all times, almost silent, with an architecture built to ensure that prisoners cannot interact with or even hear each other unless explicitly permitted to do so. People who've since been able to speak about their experiences at Lefortovo have described a facility blanketed with thick, dusty old carpeting as to muffle the sounds of inmates' footsteps. As one former detainee, ex-diplomat Valentin Myasev, said, "They're not for beauty or for pleasing the eyes of the prisoners, but so footsteps do not break the utter crypt-like silence, one that is oppressive and makes your ears ring." Another ex-prisoner, a former security analyst named Andrei Soldatov, seconded that statement, saying, "You cannot see anybody, and you are completely alone. There is not a noise. Nothing. It really makes you crazy." And not only that, but the doors are designed to open and close without noise, and thick walls inhibit the travel of any sound from other cells or from the outside world. Said Trevor Reed, a former inmate and a veteran of the US Marine Corps, quote, "This place was so locked down, I don't even know if I had yelled out that other prisoners could have heard me. Whenever you move in the prison, you see no one at all." Now, when noise does exist, it's typically coming courtesy of the guards, hitting metal pipes against the walls to warn each other that they're escorting prisoners around. That way, two prisoners are unlikely to encounter each other, even in transit. As described by Ivan Safronov, a Russian journalist who spent over 2 years there, quoting, "The purpose is to isolate a person, to freeze them in order to get confessions from them." Then there's the belittling treatment of the prison staff, who seem to be instructed to degrade prisoners with the aim of forcing subservience to the penal system itself. As ex-diplomat Moiseev wrote, "In Lefortovo, its well-established regime and the behavior of the staff suppresses you. For the very first minute, they make it clear that you are nothing, that you are alone here and completely at the mercy of the prison, and that the way out of it is possible only through complete submission to the system that it serves. Prisoners are given guarantees that they'll receive phone calls in exchange for an admission of guilt, and although few ex-detainees report having been beaten, the threat of interrogation by force seems to hang above all interactions inside. The portraits on the prison walls are of one Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of not only the modern Russian FSB, but the first Soviet secret police, the Cheka. Dzerzhinsky, better known in his time as Iron Felix, was known for orchestrating the Red Terror campaign of the early Soviet years, and he's seen as being directly responsible for the secret police system that the FSB would apparently quite like their detainees to be reminded of. And on top of this, there's the grim reality faced by any person unlucky enough to be charged with the sort of crimes that would land them in Lefortovo. Since 1999, nobody in Russia has been acquitted of charges of treason or espionage. Instead, they are uniformly found guilty after about a year of waiting in a closed-door trial where, by all accounts, the minds of the Russian legal system have already been made up. Admit guilt, and there's a chance, however small, that some of an inmate's problems might disappear. Let the system take its course, and more likely than not, the inmates themselves will disappear in the modern-day version of the same song and dance that's gone on at Lefortovo for a century. Alright, so that's Lefortovo prison in a vacuum, the cold, ruthlessly efficient processing center meant to break minds and usher its inmates toward a terribly difficult future. But just as important as the prison itself are the stories of the people who passed through its walls. In the prison's darkest days, during the Cold War, few inmates were anywhere near as high profile as one Vasily Stalin, whose shared last name with the Soviet Union's longtime dictator was no accident. After decades under Stalin's rule, in which Lefortovo had gained its reputation as the worst of the worst among Russia's prisons, his own son found his way there just a couple of months after his father's death. It survived Lefortovo, unlike countless people who had been sent there by his father's command, and it eventually served several years in a penitentiary not far from Moscow. Less famous, but arguably more important to the grand Soviet architecture, was one Vasily Blücher, who found his way to Lefortovo decades before Vasily Stalin did, and in fact, under Stalin Sr. Blücher served as the Marshal of the Soviet Union before he was swept up in Stalin's purges in 1938, but after that, the Soviet military commander would become one of the NKVD head Slaventry Beria's personal victims. Blücher was blinded by Beria and tortured relentlessly over a span of weeks or months before eventually being beaten to death within the prison walls. On the polar opposite side to Blücher, where Soviet loyalty was concerned, was Nobel Prize-winning author Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In the years prior to his authorship of a groundbreaking piece of literature, The Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn was brought to Lefortovo after a stint in another Moscow prison. After his time at Lefortovo, he would be charged with treason and serve for years in several work camps before being expelled outright from the Soviet Union. Another more recognizable name is that of Matthias Rust, a young teenager from West Germany who flew his Cessna aircraft straight through the Soviet Union's vaunted air defense system without interception in 1987, eventually landing in Red Square. Rust would stay for a year in Lefortovo before being released to the West in August 1988 during broader negotiations under Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. Among the more modern cases at Lefortovo are those of Alexander Litvinenko and Sergei Skripal. Litvinenko would be sent to Lefortovo after ending up on the wrong side of the FSB and uncovering an assassination plot. Before long, though, he'd make it out of Russia to Europe, where he would eventually be assassinated by poisoning with polonium. Sergei Skripal would also be poisoned, although he got his assassination attempt done via a nerve agent over a decade after he passed through the walls of Lefortovo en route to a longer incarceration inside Russia. And finally, there's the case of Dmitry Kolka, a scientist who had been living in Russia and trying to manage stage 4 pancreatic cancer before the FSB took him. When they did, he was unplugged from his IVs, taken without medicine or treatment, and placed in Lefortovo with no room for any reasonable FSB officer or other person to believe that he would be of any real value to them. Predictably, Kolka died of his cancer shortly afterwards, in isolation, with family protesting from the outside that he should have been afforded the privilege of a death in peace. As for the Americans who've been held in Lefortovo, there are a few key names to mention. We've already mentioned the ex-Marine Trevor Reed, who was detained in Russia and given a 9-year prison sentence after a brief but apparently quite unpleasant stint at Lefortovo. Then there's the case of Paul Whelan. Aged 48 at the time he was taken, Whelan is an American corporate security expert and ex-Marine who had been visiting Russia for a wedding at the time of his arrest. Charged with spying for a foreign power, Whelan spent roughly a year in Lefortovo, including much of that time spent with a cellmate who spoke no English. Although Whelan has since moved on through the Russian penal system, his imprisonment at Lefortovo was the subject of significant global scrutiny and was the first time that many Westerners had ever heard the prison's name. And last of all, we've got to talk about the Lefortovo detainee who is at present most famous around the world. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Seized in Russia on charges of spying in late March 2023, Gershkovich has been held in Lefortovo ever since and has spent the last year plus playing out a very high-profile legal battle with Russia in an attempt to secure his release. Gershkovich has not personally been able to relay accounts of his time in Lefortovo, but an outside commission attested that Gershkovich has access to items like a kettle and a television with a range of Russian-language channels. How the reporter himself would describe his time in the prison remains to be seen, although, if he's lucky, he might be able to tell the world himself one day. At the time of writing, Gershkovich is expected to remain at Lefortovo until at least the end of March 2024. Where he goes after that, the world won't know until Moscow sees fit to make an announcement. So that's Lefortovo prison, a murky, near opaque facility at the heart of the modern-day Russian state. Unlike the rest of the Russian penal system, it isn't in the middle of Siberia, it's not a place where an inmate can expect to be murdered by those inmates around them, and it's not overrun with tuberculosis or other fatal diseases. Instead, it's cold, clinical, designed carefully with the intent of robbing an inmate of their faculties and their claims of innocence, just as it's robbed generation after generation of inmates of their freedom and often their lives. It is a place designed to force admission of guilt and to keep prisoners focused firmly on the decades upon decades of pain that they're going to face, if indeed they're able to survive that long at all.